There is a lady in London with whom I made 3 pictures, and I've loved her for a good many years, and I love her dearly, and she may be listening tonight, and it's Ava.
It was 2003, and the world believed Gregory Peck had made peace with everything. He was 87 years old. A living legend. A name that didn't just belong to Hollywood, it belonged to history. People called him the last true gentleman of the Golden Age, and from the outside, that's exactly what he looked like. A man who had conquered everything. Lost nothing. Regretted less. But behind closed doors, something was quietly unraveling. His closest friends noticed it first. He had become different. Slower. More withdrawn. He would sit for long stretches, saying nothing, just staring at old photographs as if searching for something inside them. He stopped talking about his legacy. Stopped recounting the famous stories. Instead, he kept circling back to one thing. One person. One love that had never fully released its hold on him, even after decades, even after building an entirely new life. The people who knew him best said he carried something that had no public name. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't bitterness. It was something far quieter than either of those, and somehow, far more powerful. And in his final days, Gregory Peck finally said it out loud. Not on camera. Not in an interview. But in the soft, private way that only the truest confessions are ever made. What he admitted, left the people closest to him completely still. Because no one, not even those who had known him for 50 years, had seen it coming. To understand what he confessed, you first have to understand who Gregory Peck really was. Not the icon. Not Atticus Finch. The man underneath all of that. He was born in 1916 in La Jolla, California, a quiet coastal town that felt a world away from everything he would one day become. His childhood was fragile in ways he rarely spoke about publicly. His parents divorced when he was but something burned inside him quietly. A need not for attention, but to matter. To be worth something. To be seen by someone who truly understood what they were looking at. He found acting in college, and from the very first moment he stepped onto a stage, something shifted. He had a presence that couldn't be manufactured. A stillness that pulled focus. A voice that sounded like it was telling the truth even when it was delivering lines. By the time Hollywood discovered him in the early 1940s, America was at war, and Gregory Peck became exactly what a frightened nation needed. A face of moral strength. Of quiet courage. Of the kind of man people desperately wanted to believe still existed. The roles poured in. The Keys of the Kingdom. Spellbound. Gentleman's Agreement, a bold, uncomfortable film where he played a journalist exposing anti-Semitism at a time when Hollywood preferred to look away from that subject entirely. He wasn't just acting. He was taking stands. And then came the role that would define not just his career, but his entire identity. To Kill a Mockingbird. 1962, Atticus Finch. The man who stood alone in a courtroom, and told the truth when the truth cost everything. He won the Academy Award. But the award almost didn't matter compared to what the role did to his image. Parents named their children after the character. Lawyers said Atticus Finch was the reason they chose law. It wasn't a performance anymore, it was a portrait of conscience that an entire generation pressed close to their chests. To the world, Gregory Peck and Atticus Finch were the same man. Principled. Unbreakable. Someone who never once looked away from what was right. But what the world couldn't see, was everything But Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s had a way of quietly destroying things that looked complete from the outside. The long location shoots. The months away from home. The intoxicating world of film sets that played by their own rules, and asked nothing of anyone who stepped into them. And it was on one of those sets that Gregory Peck met someone who changed the equation. Her name was Véronique Passani, a sharp, elegant young French journalist who had been sent to interview him in 1952. She was different from anyone he had encountered in that world. She wasn't dazzled by the stardom around him. She didn't look at him like a legend. She looked at him like a person. For a man who had spent years being perceived as an image, that was everything. His marriage to Greta had been quietly fracturing for some time. They separated. And in 1955, Gregory married Véronique. By every account, it was a genuinely loving partnership. She became his anchor. His steadying force. They stayed together until the very end of his life. So if the confession wasn't about Véronique, and it wasn't about Greta, then who was it about? That's the part almost no one knew. And the answer didn't begin in the 1950s. It didn't begin on any famous film set. It went back much further than that, to a version of Gregory Peck the world never got to meet. Long before Mockingbird. Long before the awards. Long before the world had any idea who he was. In the late 1930s, Gregory Peck was still nobody. A young, uncertain actor with more hunger than opportunity, trying to find his footing in a world that had not yet decided to open its doors to him. And somewhere in that period of uncertainty, he fell in love for the very first time. Her name was almost never mentioned publicly. She wasn't famous. She wasn't someone the tabloids ever tracked. People who knew him during that time said he was an entirely different person around her. Less guarded. Lighter. The quiet seriousness that would later become his public trademark hadn't calcified yet. With her, he laughed easily. He admitted fear. He talked about his doubts without rehearsing them first. He was, in the truest sense, unfinished, and she loved the unfinished version. They were in love the way only the young and unprotected can be. Completely, recklessly, with nothing yet built to lose. But the relationship didn't survive. The specific reasons were something Gregory kept sealed for decades. What filtered through to those closest to him was only the shape of the loss. She had chosen a different path. Whether it was distance, family, timing, or simply the terrifying uncertainty of attaching your life to someone chasing something as unstable as an acting career, they let go of each other. Gregory Peck went forward. He became what he became. He became enormous. But that first love never fully receded. It just went quiet. Friends said he kept something from that period, letters, they believed, tucked away in a private place. Not as obsession. Not as damage. But the way certain people preserve something because destroying it would feel like lying about what once was real. And the truth was, even at the height of his fame, some part of him never stopped wondering. For most of his public life, Gregory managed to hold all of this in a place where it couldn't disturb the surface. He was a profoundly private man. While other stars of his generation burned spectacularly through divorces, scandals, and public disintegrations, Gregory Peck remained composed. Dignified. Seemingly untouched by the chaos around him. But then came the loss that broke something in him that never fully healed. The grief was something Gregory never fully recovered from. People who saw him in the years that followed described a man who had learned a new weight of silence. He threw himself into causes, humanitarian work, political activism, mentoring, because stillness had become unbearable. Stillness meant feeling the full depth of everything he had been carefully managing for so long. And in grief, old memories do not stay in their places. Those closest to him in the late 1970s and into the 80s said something had shifted. He became nostalgic in a different way than before. Not about the films. Not about the recognition. He would talk about who he had been, the people he had known before the world had finished shaping him, the roads he had stood at the edge of and walked away from. The first love surfaced in those conversations. Quietly. Consistently. Not as a wound, but as a presence that had simply never left the room. And then one evening, in a private setting with a close friend. Gregory said something that stopped the conversation completely. He said, there was someone who knew him before any of this existed. Before the fame. Before he was anyone. And he had always wondered if the version of himself she had known was the truest version he had ever been. No one in the room said anything. Because everyone understood exactly what he meant. As he moved into his 80s, Gregory Peck began the kind of internal reckoning that belongs to the final chapter of a very full life. He had been, by nearly every honest measure, a genuinely good man. He had used his platform with intention. He had remained loyal to those he loved. He had not traded his conscience for comfort, even when comfort was being offered. And yet something remained incomplete, not a regret in the conventional sense. More like a question that had never been fully answered. What do we owe the people who loved us before we became something? Before the world shaped us into a version of ourselves we could present? Before we knew how to protect anyone, including ourselves? The first love had not waited for him. She had built a life. Moved forward. She was not a tragedy in his story. She was not a wound. But she was a mirror. The clearest reflection of who Gregory Peck had been before Atticus Finch stood behind him like permanent armor. Before the image was so fixed it couldn't be questioned. Before he became too famous to simply be a person. In his final confession to those who sat closest to him, he didn't speak with the kind of longing that dishonors a life well lived. He spoke with something rarer than that. Something more precise. He said he hoped she knew, wherever she was, however her life had unfolded, that those early days had mattered. That she had mattered. Not as the road not taken, but as the foundation. The first person who looked at him and decided he was worth believing in, before he had given the world a single reason to agree. And that debt, he said quietly, was one he could never repay. Gregory Peck passed away on June 12, 2003. Veronique was beside him. The world mourned the loss of a legend. Atticus Finch. A titan of American cinema who had stood for something in a culture that often rewarded those who stood for nothing. But the people who loved him privately mourned something else entirely. They mourned a deeply, quietly human man who, beneath every award, every accolade, every perfect public moment, had simply wanted to be known truly. The way only one person, in one brief and irreplaceable window, had ever known him. There is a word for what Gregory Peck carried all those years. It wasn't regret. It wasn't obsession. It wasn't even grief. It was the kind that asks for nothing in return. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply endures. And maybe, that was the most Atticus Finch thing about him of all. So here's the question this story leaves behind. Does anyone ever truly release the love that found them before the world finished building them? The love that came before the fame, before the carefully constructed life, before they became whoever the world decided they were supposed to be? Gregory Peck had everything the world measures success by. And still, he carried this. Quietly. Completely. All the way to the end. Tell us what you think in the comments. Does a first love ever really let go, or does it just learn to live somewhere quieter? If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. Every week, we go behind the legend and find the human being underneath. Because the real stories, the ones that never made the headlines, are always the ones worth telling.